Last summer, Phil Williams, a veteran investigative reporter working for NewsChannel 5, a local television station in Nashville, learned that a group of neo-Nazis were planning to rally at the Metro Courthouse.
Hey, I'm curious. Why Nashville? Why did you guys choose Nashville?
The only place that respects freedom of speech.
But Williams didn't show up empty-handed. He came with reams of research. Data debunking the group's main claims about Jews running the federal government, documents about the alleged criminal past of one of its members, and even evidence that the leader, who railed against pedophilia, had associations with a known pedophile of his own.
You really dislike pedophiles, don't you?
Yeah, do you like this? Wait, get a shot.
Well, I have a photo of you with a pedophile right
Oh, yeah,
there.
you got kicked out of our group.
Yeah.
Williams has spent 3 decades being this direct and unflappable. Unlike much of the coverage of radical groups these days, he almost never seeks to play up moments of tension or drama. Instead, he approaches the targets of his reporting, whether they're extremist group members or top government officials, with the same calm demeanor and deep preparation. And I'll be honest, it makes for great television. Later this week, Williams will be in Los Angeles to collect his 5th Peabody Award, and his 2nd in a row. And today, he's my guest on The Kicker, where we talk about his career, his recent investigations, and why he thinks local television news is uniquely suited for his style of reporting. Phil, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I do have to say I've been a big admirer of yours for a long time. So you've managed somehow to make local news stories from Nashville and the area pop up on my social media feed for a number of years now. It's very impressive.
I try hard.
Part of the timing of why we're talking now is this arbitrary thing that you're getting a Peabody Award, but this is the 2nd award in a row. And maybe it's very cool to me, but maybe kind of old hat. I mean, you've gotten, 5 of these at this point?
Correct. Yes, I've been most fortunate.
Can you talk a little bit about the project that you're being awarded for, Confronting Hate?
Yeah, confronting hate really it began well over a year ago. Initially called "Hate Comes to Main Street," and
Right.
that was really what I thought would be just one series of stories. It was about how white supremacist neo-Nazis had involved themselves in a local race for mayor in a very affluent community just outside of Nashville. Franklin, Tennessee, and a candidate named Gabrielle Hansen.
Right.
But as that project wound up, I came to realize that this was really not such a unique occurrence, that the hate was rising throughout the community. In 2024, Nashville experienced several hate groups coming to our community to protest, a group known as the Blood Tribe, a group known as the Goyim Defense League, Patriot Front, the National Justice Party. And then as I kept digging, I kept thinking, okay, well, this is going to be the end of the road. And I would find hate cropping up in other ways throughout the state. And frankly, there's a part of me that thinks, okay, this has been a problem that has been emerging in our communities for a long time that we just haven't paid enough attention to. And so it is an ongoing project. I have enough stories to last me at least through the end of the year. And so it's hard to know where this ends, but it's a story that is going to be with me for quite some time, I think.
I wonder what made you think of it as a story worth digging into as opposed to just a series of sort of extraordinary moments, right? Because we've seen, and this is now from my vantage point, we've seen a neo-Nazi rally in some downtown, and I'll think, okay, they're making a spectacle of themselves. They want some attention. We should ignore them. But something told you we need to understand who these people are, and we need to actually talk to them.
And I think that's that instinct, which I have had myself for years, I think is the natural instinct. But then when you realize, okay, this is occurring again and again and again. So why are they coming to my community? Why are they coming
Hmm.
to your community? What makes them think, okay, this area is ripe for spreading our message? We have seen these groups rising up in our communities, and they're becoming emboldened. I think the current political environment has really emboldened a lot of these groups. For example, the Blood Tribe, which is a virulent neo-Nazi group, put out a propaganda video after their visit to Nashville. And
Hmm.
in their propaganda video, they used sound from President Trump to kind of justify their cause. So much so that when I used a clip of that propaganda video, some of my viewers accused me of inserting President Trump's voice. But no, that they are latching onto this. And
Yeah.
so there's something about the current political climate that is really emboldening these groups, where they feel like they have permission to be more visible, to be more radical.
Yeah.
And even in my case, where they feel like they can get away with subtle threats.
Right.
And so I think this has been bubbling beneath the surface for years, but our instinct was to ignore it and not to sound the alarm.
Well, or not to give it oxygen would maybe be the way I would more generously think about that. But at the same time, it's there and you can't ignore it.
Yeah, and I would say, that has been our instinct, is to say we're not going to give it oxygen, but the fact is it had oxygen on its own. And so you have, especially I think we have a societal issue with young men being susceptible to being recruited into extremist ideology. And that's been happening whether we gave it coverage or not. My thinking is that by giving it coverage, by shining the light, that maybe the cockroaches will run,
Mm.
rather than just propagating it in the darkness.
Since you brought up Trump and the current political moment, we're a few months into the term, and I'm wondering if you feel like it's gotten more inflamed or if in some way having Trump back in power has caused some of these groups to feel less animated. Because a lot of what you reported on was in that interregnum period before he came back.
Yeah, that's a great question. They certainly have not been as prominent this year in this community. Now,
Yeah.
as I think about it, and I spend a lot of time in the dark places of the internet monitoring these groups. And as I think about it over the last few weeks, they certainly have been active in other communities. So I think it's probably premature to say that they are regrouping and are maybe becoming less vocal. So yeah, I think the problem still exists. And in fact, we have, examples within the administration of people with extremist ideas, that have positions of power now. So I think it's still a problem that we have to deal with.
I used to work at Vice, and I think Vice, for a national news organization, did a pretty good job of covering these movements.
Yes.
And my colleague Ellie Reeve was in Charlottesville for that very dramatic day, and it felt at the time like we were doing work that was important, and I'm proud of that work. But I also think there's something very unique about the way you do these stories, and I've always felt that watching them. There's something personal about it. And you said this earlier. You said, "Why are they coming to my town?" When you walk up to one of these groups protesting in front of some municipal building in Nashville, you are asking them, why are you here in my city? Is that personal piece of it important to how you think of how you tell these stories?
Absolutely, because we live in a time where there's distrust in the media, and so when I approach it as why are you in my community? Why are you in our community? That communicates to the viewer, this is why I'm doing this story. This is why it's important. And
Hmm.
and then the other aspect of my approach is that too often we let these groups, with their anger and with their just horrific use of language, we let that kind of drown out rational thought.
Hmm.
And so one of the things I've done with confronting members of the Goyim Defense League, for example, is to confront them with the ignorance of what they're saying.
And very matter of factly.
Exactly. I mean, I did my research before I went to do
Yeah.
this confrontation. And, for example, they claimed that all aspects of the Biden administration were Jewish.
Right.
Well, I took the cabinet and researched their religious traditions, their religious backgrounds, and confronted them with facts. And I thought it was a very unique moment because the neo Nazis were also live streaming this.
Right. Right.
And I kept confronting them with so and so is Baptist, so and so is Catholic, so and so is Episcopalian.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, the head of the Going Defense League, a guy named John Minadeo, he turns to his own camera going, "This guy's lying," because I was confronting them with facts that they're not normally forced to confront.
Well, I watched that whole scene recently a couple times because I just thought it was so remarkable. And again, I think of it a little bit in the context of Vice, not to besmirch the Vice style, but I think there's a tendency in national media, maybe in particular, is susceptible to this. To you kind of go talk to these people, and you almost have the same agenda as they do, which is to hear the most extreme thing come out of their mouths. And you went and you said, okay, you want to be public figures. I'm going to treat you like a public figure. I'm going to report on your criminal past. If you say that you are against pedophiles, I'm going to look into your associations with pedophiles, which is one of the things that you pulled out while you were there.
I was very proud of that one.
Yeah, well, it was a very powerful moment. And it said, listen, you guys are acting like buffoons, but you also pretend you want to be taken seriously. This is what that feels like.
Exactly. Because at one point, when I confronted them with their own association with pedophiles, they started shouting at me, "Pedophile protector,
They
pedophile
did.
protector."
I know. They tried to shout you down. It was incredible.
Tried to shut me down. And that really says a lot about their approach, that they want to drive rational thinkers from the marketplace of ideas. And it's really important for those of us who stand for rationality, who stand for truth, to not be pushed out, to stand up to them and to confront them with facts where they would like to spread lies.
Is it ever frightening? Are there moments where you've been worried about your safety?
Yeah, I mean, a few times. And luckily, my company, EW Scripts, is very supportive. If there are ever any times that I feel like that I need help beefing up my personal security, all I have to do is ask. I think by and large, a lot of these characters are just looking for attention. They're pretty mindful of where the line is that they can and cannot cross. And so, yeah, there have been threats aimed at me, warning me about the day of the rope is real, the day of the rope is coming. A reference to the Turner Diaries and this notion that race traitors and journalists will be hanged. But I tend to think by and large that's just them trying to get attention, and
Yeah.
I try to keep in mind that they really are just trying to get attention. They're not really threatening to follow through.
When you talk about these groups, and you've used very direct language already in this interview, but I've noticed it's throughout your pieces too. You're very upfront about how you see them. In fact, when you were speaking to that particular group, I was struck by this, that you said to their face, "When I look at you, I do not think master race," you said to him. And then your voiceover came in and you described them as a group of wounded, angry men looking for someone else to blame. And I thought about this at a moment when we in the media are having all of these conversations and debates. I mean, we have been for many years now about how direct to be, whether we should call a lie a lie. It's a little surprising that one of the places where this is happening so clearly is a local news channel in Tennessee. Does it ever get you in trouble?
No, I try to be very upfront with my viewers about this. My job is not to say, okay, here's why some think neo Nazis are bad. Here's why others think they're not so bad. But objective truth is that them spreading lies about Jews, for example, they're lies, and it's
Mhm.
okay to be very direct and to say that those are lies. It's okay to be direct and to say that this is a bunch of angry men who have not accomplished much in their lives. I think that's just speaking truth. That resonates with viewers, that I'm willing to say, this is truth, and I'm going to stand with truth.
Do you think that that kind of balancing act with viewers is different for local media than the national media? You have a relationship with your viewers, right? You've been doing this for a long time. Do you think that that's a part of the trust you've built?
I think actually that national media might be more trusted if we were more direct, because part of my approach is to be very direct. I've spent time researching this, and I can tell you, here is what is true and here is what is not true.
Hmm.
Um, you know, even I, as a incredible consumer of news, throughout my life, you know, I sometimes turn off national news because it's talking heads saying predictable things.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, if you have an issue, a political issue, for example, and you bring on the Republican to talk about that issue, and then you bring on the Democrat, you already know what they're going to say. And so, I just don't think that kind of journalism is effective. Now, my approach of being so direct does require a much more intentional focus on transparency,
Hmm.
to explain to the viewer why I'm doing what I'm doing. It also requires what I like to call the use of credible messengers. So, for example, several years ago, I did an investigation of a African American social justice group. I knew that one of the questions would be, how would members of that community trust me? And so I made a very deliberate decision that every voice criticizing that group would need to be a person of color, so that the community would be more accepting. And
Hmm.
likewise, because I live in a very red state,
Yep.
as much as possible, when I am doing stories about Republicans, I try to find conservative voices to use in that story, so that
Hmm.
viewers don't just tune me out automatically, because I could easily use a Democrat criticizing a Republican, and no one would think that was news. And so, being this direct does require a much more intentional emphasis on transparency.
I wonder if that's part of how you approached the Gabrielle Hansen story when you did it, which was one of the wilder pieces series of pieces I've ever watched, to be honest. And I very much remember it playing out in real time because it was just so shocking. Because although it evolved into a story about connections to neo-Nazis, in the beginning it was just a story about a politician who was a fabulist in kind of shocking ways.
Right. Right. And even that, that was a very heavily Republican community. And I think if I were to go back and look at it, you would probably find examples where I'm being very deliberate in explaining to the viewers why I'm doing this story, and also explaining to the viewers that this is not a Democrat versus Republican issue. All of the candidates in this race are Republicans. And
Yeah.
so, again, I think that's a good example of being deliberately and intentionally transparent, to kind of help the viewer to understand, okay, this isn't about politics. This is about the larger issue. One of the pieces was about her ties to Christian nationalism. And again, as I recall, I started that piece with an explanation of, this is not about her faith. This is about a much larger issue.
Do you think you can just for listeners who may not be as familiar with the story, do you think you can give a short synopsis of that series of pieces?
Yeah, Gabrielle Hansen was a very telegenic candidate in Franklin, Tennessee, which is such a picturesque downtown main street that it's actually been used in at least one, I think maybe two Hallmark movies. So it's kind of a quintessential Southern town. And she likely was going to win this mayoral election because turnout was traditionally low. She had a very intense supporter group.
And she was a sitting alderman, right? She wasn't. She
She
wasn't
was a
just a
sitting
person from the
alderman,
sidelines.
yes. And I got into it with someone, basically begging me. It's like, please come pay attention to this race. Something's not right with this woman. And so, like, immediately within a day or two of, taking a look at the race, I found that she was using photos of supposed supporters. That when I did a image search, I was able to identify some of the people in the photos, and was able to interview several of them who said they had never even heard of her.
Right. What was
So
like a women's leadership group or something? Yeah.
exactly, and so
Yeah.
it went from that to a bizarre story about her having a criminal record in Texas for promoting prostitution. She claimed to have had a premonition of the Covenant School shooting in Nashville,
Right.
and she claimed to have told police about this premonition during a visit to her home. Well, I got the police body cam
Right.
video, and she had never brought up any such thing. It was just one bizarre story after another. And then she shows up at a candidate forum with these very rough looking guys providing security. Well, one of them, again, this is one of the advantages of being a local reporter. One of them had actually threatened to kill me like 15 years before. And
God.
and I recognized him as being part of a hate group, and so that started that aspect of the story. And so, yeah, it was just a bizarre series of stories.
One of the other pieces you did recently that I thought was very powerful was the Revealed series that looked at the quiet, well, not so quiet, but certainly behind closed doors power that lobbying groups have in the state capitol there. Can you tell us a little bit about that piece? Because I just thought I was just watching the full length hour long documentary of it, which is just incredible. Which is incredible reporting.
Yeah, that was one that was really a passion project that came out of everything that happened in 2021 with, J6 and everything that happened that year. And I found myself just really wrestling with, in this moment, what can I do that is relevant to my viewers?
Hmm.
And that's increasingly how I choose to focus my energies, is trying to figure out what's relevant to the moment. And the one thing that struck me that united us is our sense that the system is broken. Now, we have different ideas of how the system is broken and what can be done to fix it, but we are united in the sense that our political system is broken. And so I set out to really focus for a good 2 years on how laws are made on Tennessee's Capitol Hill. From the whining and dining that occurs with political fundraisers to actually following legislation through the Tennessee General Assembly, focus heavily on bills being pushed by Airbnb.
Hmm.
And I actually did something that most lawmakers don't do, which is I read the legislation and was able to point out that what the sponsors were saying that the bill did, was far different from what the bill actually would have done.
Right. Courtesy of the influence of lobbying groups who had things that they wanted in there.
Exactly. And, was able to, outside legislative hearings, to stop and interview the sponsors and confront them with what they had said versus the reality of what the legislation would actually have done. In that case, the legislation, again, which seemed destined to pass, ended up dying. And as far as I know, Airbnb hasn't attempted that legislative push since then.
Yeah.
And actually, that's one of the downsides of my latest focus on hate, is I think there are probably a lot more shenanigans happening on Tennessee's Capitol Hill,
Right.
because I'm not able to focus as intensely on following specific pieces of legislation.
Because you and your, I'm sure, incredible and talented producers can't all be in a million places at once.
Exactly. I mean, we have a larger investigative team than normal. than most stations do. But even that, we're stretched thin.
Yeah.
I have one photojournalist, Brian Staples, that I've worked with for 25 years, and we're staying busy, and there's just not enough of us to go around.
Well, watching Revealed, I think about the process as much as I think of the substance. And there are a couple moments where I was struck by you clearly knowing the people and them knowing you, who you're interviewing. There's like a lobbyist at some point who's going into one of these $1,000 plate meals right before the session starts. And I think you specifically say, we've known each other for 30 years. And I wonder if that kind of longevity, and specifically being a local television reporter, if you think that puts you in a position to tell these stories more richly than maybe others can.
Absolutely. And I say that from probably a couple of different aspects. Is number one, the players, you know where the bodies are buried. But if you've also been a responsible journalist, then there's a certain level of trust that enables you to be able to ask the tough questions without necessarily burning the bridges. For example, in that case, I think that was actually the lieutenant governor, and I've known him for 30 years,
Oh, you're right.
since
Yeah.
since I was a young reporter, and he was a backbencher in the Tennessee House. And because that I have relationships, and because I don't burn bridges unnecessarily, I was able to have a very frank conversation with him and ask him, why should people not look at this as a shakedown?
Right. That was the question you kept provocatively putting to people and seeing how they responded to it.
Yeah, and I think that's another critical piece of how I do my stories is I compare it to for anyone who likes racquetball, the shot that hits right at the corner where the ball rolls off.
Mm,
And I use that example because I try to find the question that people cannot squirm out of.
right.
And boil it down to its essence of, this looks like a shakedown. Why should I not view this as a shakedown?
And I think these two ideas go hand in hand, because one of their primary tactics, probably for a lot of politicians, is to attack the messenger. And I think you make that very hard because of your reputation.
Reputation, and as tough as my questions are, I also try to, treat them as human beings and to not be unnecessarily provocative.
Yeah.
So I think if you look at that piece, I was confronting the lieutenant governor with some pretty tough questions, confronting the speaker of the house with some pretty tough questions. And they knew that I was probably going to keep asking the question until I got a straight answer.
So you might as well just get it over with now. Phil, how do you, before we go, I mean, it's 2025. We all are sitting certainly in our national media towers, fretting quite a lot about the state of journalism right now. From your position, how do you feel about the state of journalism?
I fear for the state of journalism, especially because of declining resources.
Mm-hmm.
I recognize that I am in a pretty darn unique situation, that I have the privilege of pursuing the stories that matter to me. And I have the support of a great company that understands that this job is not always easy. I mean, as you and I are speaking, I'm, have just in the last 12 hours found out about a lawsuit that was being filed against me by
Of course. Yeah.
one of these figures. And there has never been a suggestion by my company that we don't do this type of important reporting.
But that's not true of every company right now, right?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and that's, when I watch what's happening with CBS and 60 Minutes,
Yeah.
I fear that, if we don't have the courage to stand up to efforts to intimidate us, then we're not going to have the privilege of continuing to do this type of work. So I think standing up is more important than ever.
Phil, thank you so much for taking the time.
My privilege.
The Kicker is brought to you by the Columbia Journalism Review and produced by Amanda Dara. I'm your host, Josh Hirsch.